Hello everyone, welcome to the latest of our onshore wind discussions that we're having here at Burgess Salmon on various topics. I'm joined today by colleagues on the regulatory side, Alec and Andrew Parmar-Yee. We think it's important to look at onshore wind. Onshore wind is facing a resurgence. The new government has indicated that it wants to free up the deployment of onshore wind in England once again after some years of putting the brakes on that. So what we can imagine a world, or at least a UK world, where onshore wind is encouraged to be deployed in the coming years. We've got an enormous amount of experience of onshore wind in Burgess Salmon, having been around for the very first deployments all the way through. So we thought it was a timely point to remind everyone about some of the issues that sector faces. So I guess turning to you both, my first question would be, in terms of those, 20 years from the first deployments, a lot has obviously changed on the regulatory side, on the grid side, on the incentive side. Would one of you like to highlight some of the key changes that you would point to?
Yeah, I'll start there.
Yeah.
I think that when you look at the world today and when you compare it to when the first wave of projects were being rolled out, there's a general public perception and general acceptance of renewables and a trust in the system and the renewables deployment. And generally speaking, projects are being seen as more cost effective, more fundable by banks, and generally more trusted by the public and by developers across the sector.
I'm sure that's right, but certainly in the early days, we were fighting with onshore wind with a regulatory system that wasn't really fit for purpose. And so everyone was trying to find workarounds, and the legislation and regulation was having to change almost on the hoof. Are we in a better place now?
Certainly, yes. I think that when you look at projects being deployed now and being developed now, the regulation has caught up with the ambition for onshore wind projects. And actually there is real investment and real emphasis and kind of real momentum behind the development of these projects. And that is twinned with a regulatory framework that matches that.
Yeah. And Alec, on the incentive side, I guess the early wind projects, well, even if you go back to the non-fossil fuel obligation, but we had the renewables obligation, that's changed and evolved, hasn't it?
It has, in a massive way. And I think that goes back to what Andrew was talking about around the change in the regulatory environment and what's happened and the drive to bring forward new projects. So obviously we had the RO, we had feed-in tariff, and we've had the CFD regime now around for a good 10 to 15 years. All of which are very positive. And what we now have is the main form of incentive scheme, which is the CFD. That's a competitive auction, and that has brought about changes. Cost efficiency these days is very important, more so than potentially it has been, because it used to be that if you developed a project, you would get the support. It might be a different banding or a different feed-in tariff, but the support would be available. And now there is very much a competitive allocation process to get the support. But what we are seeing is corporates come into the market as well, and lateral thinking around other forms of revenue generation. So co-location with hydrogen, co-location with battery storage or data centers, and also large corporates purchasing green power and looking to drive forward innovation and actually additionality. So bring forward projects that wouldn't necessarily have come to the market unless they step in to offer a long-term fixed price on the power.
Thanks. I want to move, if I could, to one of the thorny issues that's out there for all renewables projects, and I guess will be for onshore wind in the UK, and that's the availability of grid and grid connections. Who wants to tackle that one?
I'll tackle that one, Ross.
Okay.
Thanks very much. I think that's an incredibly topical question at the moment. So for those of you who are following grid developments, it's quite an exciting time. There's lots of documents being published by various people. The heady rate of knots and just staying on top of it is proving quite hard at the moment. But in essence, what's going on is we're moving from a first come, first served mechanism where there was historically a lot of capacity. So it was never a question of could you find the capacity at grid for onshore wind. It was always a question of where could you strategically locate your project which had a good wind resource but also lower grid costs, and it was trying to find that sweet spot. What we're moving to now across all of the UK is significant constraints in our grid system. Whilst the upgrades that are required come forward, so bootstraps, transmission reinforcement works, and also just trying to manage the very intermittent nature of renewables, along with storage and various other things. So what that's leading to is constraint, quite frankly, in terms of finding that grid connection capacity. It's not to say that it's not there, but for projects that are looking to be developed now, it might be that you have quite late connection dates. It might be that the connection costs are high. We're also seeing a proposed reformation of the way that grid connection offers and agreements are issued to different parties, and that is proposed to be a system-first approach. So you might hear people talk about alignment with Clean Power 2030, and what they're talking about is effectively the National Energy System Operator looking to ensure that those projects that are strategically located and will be most beneficial to the system potentially get connected first.
Okay. And I suppose so you've highlighted there one of the areas where you might want to look at what the future holds to insulate your project. If you're an onshore wind developer, what other things might you be thinking about in terms of insulating your project going forward? Andrew?
Yeah, I think that one of the key points that developers need to be thinking about at the very early stage of development is how, and Alec touched on this earlier, but is how you can maximize your revenues. Ultimately, we are now in a world where there are constraints, and depending on your view on the wholesale market, there is ultimately going to be volatility, and therefore trying to kind of consider from a very early stage what are the potential revenues that you can generate under your project is important. I think that there are more sophisticated ways these days from the first wave of projects that can be done, whether that's hydrogen, whether that's battery storage, whether that's looking at private wire opportunities.
So we're talking about co-location there and these hybrid projects that are coming forward.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I entirely echo that. I think what we're seeing now is an idea around optionality and trying to future-proof in the early stages of projects. So when we're looking at options and leases, when we're looking at planning, it's all around adding in components that give developers, bankers, funders the ability to restructure as the regulatory environment changes, and as does the commercial environment. So I think a lot of people are starting to include battery storage on their projects as a kind of standalone basis or as a co-located basis. Also hydrogen production is about thinking about those opportunities early and trying to have those conversations and making sure the documents leave open those possibilities but without closing off other possibilities, and that's quite hard. It takes a bit of consideration, and fundamentally at some point you're going to have to make a decision around which commercial way you're going to develop and maximize your revenue. But until then, trying to keep that optionality open, I would say, is one of the key changes that we are seeing in the market at the moment.
Yeah, and I guess we're seeing as well, would it be fair to say a bit more of a sophistication? That the point about any renewables now is really, you always did have to look to the revenue streams, but if you had the RO years and years ago, you had a guaranteed form of revenue stream if you built the project. Now, as you say, it's not open to everyone. You have to bid in. So what are your revenue streams for that project? And that's really got to be the big fundamental for any renewables project. I mean, we talk about land, very important. Obviously, you can't build anything if you don't have land. But ultimately, whether this project is going to get built or not is going to depend on what you can do with the electricity that you produce and the price you get. Are we seeing a lot more sophistication in those sort of power purchase agreements, route to market agreements and things like that?
I think there's definitely been an evolution in what the market's prepared to offer and what we're seeing in terms of terms. So it used to be 10, 15 years ago, you might have a index-linked PPA, so a percentage of the day-ahead price, N2EX, APX, etc. We're certainly moving to longer-term fixes in the market, whether that be with corporates or with utilities. So I'm sort of looking at the moment 10-year fixes, so which are quite attractive and obviously brings forward some financing considerations. But what we're also seeing is a level of nervousness around long-term negative pricing, and that's based on some of the forward curves and what other people are predicting. I think the other thing is also just, we haven't mentioned it yet, but the review of electricity market arrangements and the uncertainty going forward around how zonal pricing might work if it gets introduced or not. That's definitely having a consideration, and I think it is one of the things that people will naturally have to think around with onshore wind. Strategic locations for wind, brilliant, lots of resources up in the north and various other things in UK, but not necessarily the most profitable region potentially if we bring forward zonal pricing. So there is always going to be a trade-off, and obviously that's subject to a lot of different consultation responses at the moment.
Okay. I suppose whilst we're touching on location, one thing that developers need to be thinking about while we don't have it yet is the applicability criteria. That's going to be in Clean Power's 2030, and actually thinking about the location of your project and actually how you might get a quicker connection date depending on where your project is going to be located.
Yeah, so just to put on what Andrew was saying, I think the point that we are looking at is the breakdown of the tech queue and the distributed connection queue, which has an impact on the transmission network, into different technologies. And the idea being that there will be an alignment with Clean Power 30 to bring forward those technologies that the National Energy System Operator believe are the most beneficial for that kind of that individual location. So there is a real opportunity there for onshore wind, potentially as opposed to other technologies, because if you look through the Clean Power 2030 guidelines, it looks like the queue of proposed projects that are going to be connected aren't actually as high as some of the requirements in strategic locations. So it might be that you actually get accelerated, which is a real positive for onshore wind.
Okay. Well, look, I'd like to finish up. Thanks. That's really useful, both of you. Finish up on top tips for developers. So here we are. We're in a scenario where the government would like to have more onshore wind built in England. We continue to have it built in Scotland and Wales, but overall, they'd like an increase in onshore wind. What are your top tips for developers now?
Andrew, do you want to go first?
Yeah, for sure. I think that something that's probably underpinning all of the points that we've touched on is developers planning early and getting rewarded for planning early and having very clear strategy, whether that's about your grid connection, whether that's about your offtake arrangements, or whether that's about your location. Planning early is ultimately going to see huge benefits to developers and for projects and the future and future-proofing of those projects.
Okay.
I think I'd echo that. I think planning is key, and also just engagement. There are an awful lot of variables at the moment. Engagement with the local community is obviously very important. We've had planning reforms to the regime in England, which is incredibly positive, and our planning team are kind of very, very excited about that.
And by the way, we will have a separate session on that.
Yeah. Sorry, good segue. But I think its engagement with the local community is incredibly important as well to bring forward these projects. And not only from a project's perspective, as in the actual turbines, but actually also from a grid perspective, contingent on the scale. Some of the infrastructure required for the large onshore wind farms is causing some tension.
Yeah.
And then I think I'd echo Andrew's point around revenues. I think revenues are a key focus, and having those conversations early, particularly where you've got a major energy user or a proposed off-taker involving hydrogen production or otherwise, knowing what that is and trying to bottom that out early on is key.
Okay. Well, look, thanks to both of you for that. Really useful. If you'd like to find out more about the team's views on this, then please contact any of us via our website. These will be put up on our website as well, and you can also go to our YouTube channel and look at them all and the series that we're doing in respect of onshore wind. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ross.
Thanks.